I'm going to tell you first how I happened to meet these people. And I have to go way back to where I grew up in Cambridge, Nebraska. And my grandmother was a concert violinist. And she had concertized around the United States after studying in Vienna for several years. And after 10 years of concertizing, she met my grandfather and settled down in Cambridge. So I grew up in a musical family, playing in the family string quartet, playing violin. And when I was ready to go to college, everybody thought I would major in music with my violin. But I had fallen in love with the opera. So I majored in music, but in opera and voice studies. And when I finished my master's degree and was married and we were starting our family, we were moving around the country, and I directed opera and music theater and did a lot of singing with symphonies and things like that. And we were in Alabama and then California, and then in the middle 80s we moved our family back to Lincoln. Got our kids out of California. So once we were here in Lincoln, PC computers were beginning to be interesting to folks. So we got into computers. And I could always use my computer skills to do programs and scripts and things like that for the children's music theater camps and things like that I was teaching. So I was building up some computer skills. Well, then when my children were getting close to college age, I thought I need a more reliable income. So I went to work full-time in computers, and I did computer tech support for the Nebraska legislature. And then they wanted me to build them a website, so I had to learn how to do web development. And doing the web development, I had to get some more graphic skills. So through that, when I finally retired from that hectic, very stressful, anything in computers and web development is a very stressful, constantly changing career. So in 2000, I retired from that. Well, a little before that, through all those years, I was still always a singer. There wasn't a week that went by that I wasn't learning repertoire for my next performance, or just getting ready for a rehearsal or in rehearsal. So it was a constant part of my life. And I thought of myself as a singer first and as a computer tech support person second. Well, as a mom first, of course. But my whole being just seemed to think, you know, you're a singer, Mary, that's who you are. Well, in about 1997, I was directing a group of girls from all over the state down at Doane College, and we had 7 hours to get ready for our performance through a convention for that weekend. And I had some allergies to the trees on campus. And by the end of the rehearsal, I was so hoarse. It was a 6 or 7 hour rehearsal. I was so hoarse that I could not even whisper. And I had damaged my voice so badly that my cords were frozen in certain areas. And for the next 5 years, I could sing 2 or 3 notes in the middle of my voice. So I was no longer a singer. That was a black hole. That was, you know, my creative outlet was my singing. And that was gone, just overnight, just gone. So I started writing. And if it hadn't been for losing my voice, I wouldn't have written a word yet today. I'm just sure of it. So I was writing. In 2000, I retired from the full-time computer work and began writing. And that was really very fulfilling. I wrote, my first book was called Into the Mouth of the Wolf, which is about a girl from Nebraska who went to Vienna to sing in the opera. In the opera, we don't say break a leg. We say nella bocca del lupo, which means into the mouth of the wolf. If you picture a concert hall or an opera house, if you're standing on stage, you're looking out at those tiers of opera boxes in the balconies, okay? It looks like you are looking straight into the mouth of the wolf if you're standing center stage. So we wish for people to be good enough that they make it center stage. If they make it center stage, they have made it into the mouth of the wolf. So that's why it's a good luck thing for us. And that book won me an agent in New York and all of that. But it fell between genres. It was a little bit dark and gothic. It was a historical, and it had threads of romance, and a hero and a heroine, and a very dark, malevolent baron. But it didn't fall right down the lines that a publishing house is looking for. When an editor at a publishing house is looking to acquire a book, they need to know that it fits right into the genre that they're required to fill. And they may only have 12 slots a year, or 1 a month, that they can fill. They've got 1,000 manuscripts on their desk, and 1 of those can go this month, and 1 of those can go next month in their particular genre. So the publishing houses are not going to take a chance, or at least in 2003 and 4, they weren't going to take a chance on a book that didn't speak right to the genre lines. And I thought, how boring is that? You know, if I can already predict where a story is going to go, why would I read it, you know? But that's what they wanted, or they wouldn't put their money in it. So I wasn't successful in shopping around Into the Mouth of the Wolf. Well, right about that time, my church, St. Mark's United Methodist Church, asked me to come in and work full-time for them. They needed a graphic artist, and they were starting to build a new sanctuary and all that. So I went to work with them full-time. And the reason I gave you this whole journey is because one day when I was sitting in my office at St. Mark's, this tall, lanky guy who looks like Clint Eastwood came and stood in my doorway and said, "I'm looking for somebody to write a book." It was Bob Chambers, and he had heard from the pastor there that I had done some writing and all of that. And so he came to me and said, "I'm looking for somebody to write a book." And I said, "Well, what's it about?" And he, in 5 minutes, he had me so hooked on his story that I said, "Bob, you need to come to my house and tell me more about this. This is just fascinating." Because he started out by telling me just about his mother and the fact that she was called to go be a missionary doctor in India. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So that in itself was fascinating. Well, he comes to my house that night with Mame, his wife, and he has 5 notebooks. You know the 3-ring binders with the big fat spine that can hold 500 pages? He had 5 of those.
Oh my!
And they were jammed with the letters that his mother, Dorothy Kinney, had written home from India when she was a doctor there. So here were 5 books of research, and I thought, wow, with all of that, I could really tell that story. And then he says the second part of the story, where after her 10 years there, she fell in love and got married to another missionary, started their family, and were posted to the Philippines. And when they got to the Philippines, baby Bobby, here on the cover, was born. I'll have a picture that you can look at in a minute. Bobby was born in the Philippines. And when he was 18 months old, the Japanese were threatening to take the islands. And I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you a little bit more about India, and then I'll tell you more about the Philippines. When Dorothy was in medical school, she knew that and she's from Colorado. She was in medical school in Boulder. And she knew that she wanted to be an obstetrician. She wanted to work in gynecology. And this really started when she was 12 years old and helped deliver a baby under a viaduct out in the country in Colorado. And she wanted to be an obstetrician. Well, when she graduated second in her medical class. But OB/GYN was a coveted thing for men at that time in 1928, and they were so fearful that all the women, half the women in their practice, would leave them and go to a woman OB/GYN. So they made sure that a woman was not allowed to be an OB/GYN. There was no opportunity for her in 1928. No opportunity for her to practice medicine the way she wanted to. So she applied to the American Baptist Association, and she accepted a post in India. She was to go and set up a hospital for women in the remote areas of India. When she got there, the clinic was a thatched roof with poles for walls, no walls, just open air. It was a tabernacle. And that's where she did surgery by Coleman lantern light. That was how she found her primitive circumstances when she got there. No running water, no electricity. Now they had a storage place where there were some sterilizers that had been donated by a hospital in New York. But they couldn't use them, no electricity. So it was several years before they had an enclosed building, but she was in charge of building all this up. A brand new building, completely enclosed with clinic facilities, electricity, and running water. And she did that in 10 years in those remote circumstances, and begging, money from whoever would donate here in the States or there in India. So she had a wonderful experience. Every week she wrote a letter home, and she outlined everything she had done that week, all the patients she had seen, what kinds of maladies they had, what kinds of surgeries she performed, how she had to have a local artisan make a surgical instrument because she couldn't get one. And she'd been asking for one for months and couldn't get one. So she described it and kept working with this artist until they had been able to make the surgical instrument that she needed. Dorothy was not one who would say, "It can't be done." If it was a situation that she was there and felt that her expertise could solve things, if she had one item, she would figure out, how do I create that item, or what can I make that item out of? What can I repurpose in order to have the things that I need? She used mosquito netting to make a body cast for a boy with tuberculosis, and you know, she was just innovative. Her mind just crafted these things, and she made it happen. So she was just brilliant in the way she approached her medical duties there in India. But she had all along, she had felt that being a wife and mother was her supreme calling in this world. And as the 10 years went on, she became more and more melancholy about the fact that she did not have a family. And then she met Fred Chambers. He was the head of the boys' school in Jorhat, just a couple of hours away from where Dorothy was, in Gauhati. And it was a medical situation that caused them to meet. He needed a doctor, and she wasn't allowed to treat men. She was only allowed by the government to treat women. Had to get special dispensation to look at his sinus problem. Yeah. But that's how they met. And they fell in love. And once they were married, they had Carol Joy. Their first child was Carol Joy, a baby girl. And then they decided to take a furlough back to the United States. And while they were back in the States, they accepted a call to go to the Philippines. So the day they left San Francisco for the Philippines was the day before Germany declared war, World War II. And while they were out in the middle of the ocean, their ship was painted battleship gray, so it wouldn't look like they were, so that they could run disguised in the convoy of military ships. Half of the people got off the ship at Hawaii and said, you know, we're going home. And here was Dorothy and Fred with their little girl, and Dorothy was pregnant with her second. She was pregnant with Bobby. They could have gotten off that ship and gone home to safety. But they had agreed to go to Iloilo, and they were not going to turn back. So they got to the Philippines, they got to Iloilo, and it was a beautiful situation for Fred. He was on the faculty of Iloilo Community University, and Dorothy worked in the hospital for the first time, a modern hospital that somebody else had built that she hadn't had to build herself. And she passed her Philippine medical requirements. She had to do that to be allowed to practice as a doctor in the Philippines. She passed those, and then she was a doctor in the hospital, and all was good. Well, then the Japanese began to come closer and closer to taking the islands. And there were about 30 missionaries in the group that Dorothy and Fred were in, and they met regularly. When it came time to decide what they should do, Fred wanted Dorothy to take the children and go home. She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't leave him. It was her choice. She would not take the children and leave Fred there. And all of the missionaries were wrestling with their own decisions personally, and then what they would do as a group. And since the two choices were to go into the hills, and I know you've heard this story from your pastor, which I'm so thrilled that he's familiar with that part of history. They had the choice of going into the hills and hiding out, and their Filipino friends would take care of them and bring them food, and then of course they would in turn take care of their Filipino friends. Or they could stay with the hospital. Well, Dorothy's attachment to the hospital was really, really strong, and so that was an easy decision for her. And she and Fred both felt that with the Red Cross association that they would be safe in the hospital, that the Japanese would not bother them if they were at the hospital. So they stayed at the hospital. And while about 20 other of the missionaries with their children as well went into the hills and established this little hut community called Hopevale. Dorothy and Fred stayed with their family at the hospital. Well, when the Japanese came, they did not pay any attention to the Geneva Convention of leaving Red Cross facilities untouched. They took all Americans from the facility into a prison camp. All Americans and any other country that wasn't sympathetic to Japan. Any other nationals who weren't sympathetic to Japan were taken into a prison camp. So Bobby was 18 months old. His sister Carol Joy was 4 years old. Dorothy and Fred were taken with their 2 children into the prison camp. And from that time on, for 3 years, they nearly starved. They ate things like mouse hearts. And one Christmas, they dug up canna bulbs. They knew where, a couple of years before that, some cannas had grown, but were no longer growing, but they knew the bulbs must still be in the ground there. And they dug up those canna bulbs, and they could have been shot for doing that, because that was not allowed. They were only allowed to do on the grounds what the Japanese prescribed that they could do. But they dug up those canna bulbs, and Dorothy shredded them, and she had some mouse hearts and braised the mouse hearts to make a gravy, and put the gravy on the shredded canna bulbs, boiled shredded canna bulbs. And that was their Christmas dinner, the 3rd Christmas in the camp. And Bob still remembers, he says, I can still taste it today. He said it was the best thing I'd ever eaten. He can still taste it today. There's a wonderful story in the book how they were to get their Red Cross boxes, 1 box a month per family. Now there were 4,000 people in the prison camp that they were in at Santo Tomas. And each family was to get a Red Cross box, a relief box every month. They got 2 in 3 years. 2 boxes in 3 years. The Japanese stored them in a local bodega and used them with the troops. Did not distribute them. But one year, the last year, a Japanese clerk who was very sympathetic towards the plight of the prisoners, he slipped an order to distribute those boxes. He slipped it into a pile of papers that he handed the commandant of the camp. And the commandant is signing and putting his red hatch mark stamp on all of these. And he didn't realize he had stamped the one that says distribute 800 boxes. Well, there is such honor among those commandants that once that order was signed, he could not back out from it. He had put his, and it escapes me now what they call that red stamp. I've got it in the book. But once he had put that red stamp on it, you could not back out of it. So they got to distribute the 800 boxes. And Fred Chambers, Bobby's father, was one of the people that was taken to the bodega to help bring the boxes into the camp, which I'm sure he was very excited about. That was Bobby's first taste of chocolate. And have any of you, if anybody has had an opportunity to read the book, you might recognize when Bobby had his first taste of chocolate. They had given him one little square. And the chocolate bar had all these squares. They gave him one little square. And I should tell you, prior to this, his most favorite snack was licking the butter off the wax paper that was wrapped around. And he would chew on that paper because he could get every bit of salt and butter out of it. That was a very infrequent treat, but when he got to have that treat, it was wonderful. So now here was his first taste of chocolate, and he was 4 years old at this time, had lived in the camp since he was 18 months, and he said, "Sweet Jesus, that's good." And his missionary mother and father looked at him like, "What did you say?" And he didn't know what he said, you know. He'd never had an opportunity to be so blissful and so thrilled with something that was the most wonderful thing he could think of to say was "Sweet Jesus." And his sister said, "You shouldn't have said that. You should not have said that." And he thought about it, and he thought, "Well, what's so wrong with that? What did I say? What could I possibly have said that was just not acceptable?" And then he says, "Oh, I know. Sweet Jesus, that was good. Amen." So I have a little refrigerator magnet for each of you. I'll pass these around. It's a picture of Bobby and Carol, just a month before, 2 months before they went into the prison camp, and you'll see these sweet faces, so happy. And it says "Sweet Jesus, Amen."
Mary,
Yes.
Bob spoke to our brunch group one year. I think it's about 10 years ago.
It's
Do you
been
remember?
about that, yeah.
Yeah, he never told us that story.
He didn't. He didn't.
No.
Oh, yes. And I want you to put this on your refrigerator. And the next time you open that refrigerator, you think there's just nothing in here. You know, nothing to eat. You look at those two little faces and you think, there's something in here I can eat. But that's from us two.
I didn't get one.
They are just beautiful babies. But in writing the story, I just couldn't fathom experiencing that. You know, taking your children into a prison camp and then busying yourself with your doctoring and your children are just, you know, being left to fend for themselves with a nanny. They had another prisoner who looked after them. But the things that she had to be willing to do to get people through that, you know, were just amazing. Well, that was their last Christmas in the camp, and in February, General MacArthur got wind that the Japanese realized they were losing this war, and they were going to retreat from the islands. But the Japanese did not leave prisoners behind. So when they retreated, the last thing they were to do before retreating was to kill all prisoners. We have in the book the copy of the kill order to execute everyone in camp. They were bringing barrels of gasoline into the camp, and they put them under the stairway in the building and in areas around where the people had built huts to live in, nipa huts. And they were going to just explode and burn the entire camp, and you know, anybody who was trying to flee would be shot. So General MacArthur had spent a lot of time in the Philippines prior to World War II. In fact, the gal who was sort of a nanny to Bobby and Carol, her father was a businessman, an American businessman in the Philippines, in Manila. And he had the air conditioning venue. He was the only place in all of the islands where you could buy air conditioning units. And so he was very wealthy. And because he worked among all the islands, he had a number of Filipinos who were loyal to him, very loyal to him. They helped get food over the walls to him. They helped get money into the camp for him. So I think through that network, I was talking about General MacArthur. General MacArthur often stayed at the Soleil's house because he was a wealthy businessman there. And they played cards on the sleeping porch, and then he would just stay overnight. So General MacArthur had relationships like that with a lot of the people that were in the camp. He knew them prior to the war. So there was no way he was going to let these people be abandoned. And he made this daring sweep around the island from a direction the Japanese did not expect them to come. And he liberated the camp, Santo Tomas. He liberated the camp 24 hours before the kill order was to be put into effect. So they barely survived. But then, overnight, here's little Bobby with all his GI friends. He was just in seventh heaven. All these GIs who were missing their children back home, and here were children here. They were treated really, really well by the GIs. So that's kind of the full scope of the story that this book covers. When I first wrote it, I started reading all of her letters, all of Dorothy's letters home, and I thought, I cannot do justice to this. But I thought I could do justice to the prison camp part, because a lot of books had been written on that part. You can find all sorts of memoirs written about Santo Tomas and that time of imprisonment. And I also had the book that was the daily diary of the camp committee. Now, they would have been shot for this alone. At the end, they were shot before the Japanese left, the camp committee.
Wow.
But this journal alone would have gotten them executed. No one was to write anything, no memoir, no nothing. And in the 3 years, the people were allowed 2 postcards of 20 words each. In 3 years, that's what they could write home. 2 postcards, 20 words each. And that's all that was to have gone out of the camp. Well, the camp committee knew that they weren't to keep a record. And they were searched every week for anything that they might have. A radio, if they had a radio, they would be shot. If they were keeping a journal, they would be shot. They hollowed out a column that was in the middle of their office and hid the papers in there and camouflaged where they had it hollowed out. And so they had a daily record of everything that happened in that camp, everything of significance. Every time the Japanese shorted them was supposed to give them 100 sacks of rice and only gave them 80. Things like that. Every single thing that happened in the camp is in that book. And I found a copy of that book on eBay. So I had enough fuel that I knew I could write that prison camp story. So that was the first story that I took back to Bob, when I had it ready. And then I waited to see if they liked it. Well, they liked it, but they said, we want the India part too. Well, of course they wanted the India part. You know, I had just been a big chicken. I was scared to death to write that part. It was so massive. Yeah. You know, 5 notebooks of 500 letters each. And those letters were typed, you know how you could adjust a manual typewriter so that the lines could be real close to each other, and it went from margin to margin, no area outside it, right to the edge of the paper to edge of the paper, and as many lines as you could get. I suppose you could normally get about 25 lines on a letter. They probably had 50.
Yeah.
And she wrote those letters home, and then her mother retyped them with carbon paper and distributed them to family. So her mother had kept those letters all through the years. So with all of that, I mean, it was just daunting. Every one of them was filled with 2 or 3 surgical procedures, or 2 or 3 experiences with the locals, you know, of what had happened that week. And I thought, I can't do that, you know, that's too much, I'm a chicken, you know, I cried, Uncle. And they said, no, we've got to have that India part. So I started trying to write that. Meanwhile, I was giving full-time daycare to my 2 grandbabies. And so things went kind of slow from that point. And I let my cowardliness keep it going slow. But when I finally got that written, in the middle of it, I had a meeting with Bobby Hawk, who is Bob Chambers' daughter. Bobby Hawk is a physician herself. She's a pediatric neonatal surgeon. And I met with her several times during the writing of this. And so one of the last times that I met with her while I was writing it, I said, I just don't feel like I have Dorothy's personality in my mind yet. And she says, well, I can tell you exactly who Dorothy was. And she says, do you watch Downton Abbey? Oh, sure. Oh, yes. She said, Dorothy is Mary, the older daughter who wants to be the free spirit, but won't allow herself to be the free spirit because she's the oldest daughter, the responsible child. Okay? That just opened up the whole thing for me. Suddenly, I knew who Dorothy was. And so I went back and rewrote, or added and whatever, to get Dorothy's personality into that book. So that meant once I had rewritten that, and it was closer to being right, I had to completely rewrite the prison camp part because I had to take that personality into it. So when I finally got that done, I took them the manuscript and waited until I found out if they liked it or hated it or whatever. I was a nervous wreck. And so I was meeting with them and I said, well, what did you think? And there was silence. I thought they hated it. And they said, well, we love it. But they said, but you left something out. And I said, well, what's that? And they said, the love story.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you had a chance to read all of Dorothy and Fred's love letters back and forth when they were living 200 miles apart and carrying on this relationship, they were over the top. Oh, he's radiant, and oh, she's my angel on earth, and all of this, it was just over the top. So I really downplayed, I kind of really quickly glossed over their romance and their marriage. Well, the family wasn't going to have that because they said Dorothy and Fred were insanely in love their entire life. And he died in his 80s and she lived to be 100. Wow. But they said the love story has to be there. So I tried to write the love story and I kept stumbling and struggling, couldn't do it. So then I thought, well, use the letters. So, because I thought if it wasn't the letters, people would think she's not a very good writer. She wrote this really unbelievable love story. And so I thought the only way for them to believe it, for the reader to believe it, is to read it in their own words. So that's why when you get to the love story part of the book, it's all letters. It's all communicated between Dorothy and Fred. So I went back and I wrote that part. And at this point, Bob and Mame had just moved to Colorado. And so had Bobby, the daughter. She is head of a neonatal group in Greeley now. And they are in Loveland, Bob and Mame are. So I went out, and I took the I sent them the manuscript. And then 2 weeks later, I drove out to Colorado to meet with them. And I said, okay, I can take it. What did you think? And there was silence. And Bob was there, his daughter Bobby was there, Maine was there, and nobody said a word. And finally Maine spoke up and she said, we think that while you were writing this, Dorothy came down and sat beside you.
Oh.
They felt it was that close
Wow.
to who she was. I know, I still get the chills just thinking about it. And Bob's sister, Carol Joy, had been against this project from the beginning. She had tried several times to write their story and wasn't able to do it. But when you think about it, I mean, just imagine somebody coming to you and say, okay, I'm going to write your life story, you know. Would you let them? How did they have the nerve, the courage, or how could they take the chance on letting somebody else write that story? That was a huge chance, and Carol could not do it. She wanted nothing to do with it, didn't want to interview with me, nothing. And she's a fine organist in the Detroit area, or was through her career. So anyway, Bob said, that's all right, we'll do this anyway, because he had promised his mother on her deathbed that he would write their story, and then he found that he couldn't. So he was fulfilling a promise to his mother, getting this done. So he said, well, it's too bad that Carol doesn't want to be involved, but we're doing this anyway. So I made some more tweaks and made the final manuscript. And that one they sent to Carol. Oh, they didn't send it to Carol yet, I'm sorry. We were ready to publish, and we published the book, and as soon as they had a book in their hands, they sent one to Carol. And Carol's comment after she read it was, I think she was channeling Mother. Which is almost the same thing they had said.
Yeah.
So at least you can trust that the Dorothy you meet in the book is very close to the Dorothy her children knew in their lifetime. So, in her lifetime. Dorothy went on to live to be 100 years old, and from the time they came back, were liberated and came back in 1945, she had a lot of health problems.
Yes.
She didn't go back to practicing medicine, and Carol resented that. Carol wanted her mommy to be the doctor again, and Dorothy just couldn't do it. But she started groups like this. She started groups at her church for foreign students. They would to help them learn what these strange things they were hearing from their American neighbors, what it meant, what these phrases meant that they don't understand. And she would help them, she would get them in sewing groups, doing conversational English while they were sewing to help them. So she was always doing something. And she never forgot that she was a doctor, and even in her last days in the nursing home, somebody would fall in the hallway or be calling for help, and she'd come racing down the hall in her wheelchair and say, I'm a doctor, I can help. She never quit. So, yes.
Mary, I think I told you about Ted and Jody Hartung from our church.
Yes.
They actually knew Fred and
Oh.
Dorothy. And
Yes.
Jody's in the car, but
This
she's had a problem with her. She fell, and we can't find a wheelchair to get her in here.
Oh.
But anyway, they knew them in Fort Collins when Fred served the church there. Maybe Ted, you can tell us a little.
Wonderful. Well, come on up here, and I want to, here.
But
Oops, there are some magnets. I want you to have this little picture of Bobby and Carol when they were babies, just before they went into the prison camp. That is magnetic in here. It'll hold on to your refrigerator.
Oh, wow.
Would you like to sit here and talk?
No, I'll just visit with you
Okay.
briefly.
Some here on the table.
Anyway, okay, I'll take one of these for Jody.
Yes, please.
Maybe perhaps you would like to swing by and she could visit you briefly on your departure?
I will.
Okay.
I will, for sure.
Well, we experienced the Chambers in establishing a church in Fort Collins, and Pastor Fred helped us build that church, and Dorothy helped provide food for the crew, and so that Jody and she were in Sunday school classes together, and then ultimately Jody's mother lived in that retirement center with Dorothy, and so she actually got an opportunity to visit from time to time at meals with Dorothy Chamber, and it was just a wonderful experience as a couple. It was very easy to understand in reading that book. That was a fantastic sharing of her experience in meeting Fred as a patient, and so we have deep and very great feelings for the Chambers.
How could you not? And you say you have the book and you have read it?
Yes.
You can put this inside it. The book won the 2019 Illumination Silver Award for Best eBook with a Christian Worldview. So this is the,
Yeah.
if any of you have the hard copy and would like to put
I don't know where mine went to.
Mine's on Kindle. Oh,
I had the book, but I shared it with the group, and I don't know what happened to it. I don't have it.
well,
oh dear.
Here,
I'm gonna leave one.
Mary.
well, Shirley has
Oh,
that
there's
here.
another one. Okay.
I'm gonna-
Do you have someone you'd like to share the book with if I give you another one?
All right. Yes, our
Okay.
granddaughter,
I was gonna ask.
There you
her
go.
daughter knew her too.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to leave one, may I leave one with your group that you could pass around too?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, how about if I put one of these in the front?
Give it to Dan there, she can.
I can't stick it on my Kindle. That's a problem.
How did you meet Dorothy?
I never met Dorothy.
Oh,
I met Bob. He
oh,
was at St. Mark's United Methodist Church where I was working.
oh,
And
okay.
he came, stood in my doorway and said, "I'm looking for somebody to write a book."
Oh,
And as soon as he told me 5 minutes worth of his story, I said, "I'm hooked." So I had him come over to the house and he brought me all of Dorothy's letters, 5 notebooks filled with her letters from India and pictures and so forth. So it was a great collaboration, but I made him wait 8 years for the book because I was doing research and I was a coward, afraid to write it, and I was full-time babysitting for my 2 grandchildren. Oh,
That's her.
that's me. Sorry.
Do you know why Mary never, Dorothy, why Dorothy didn't go back into medicine?
Yes, she had health issues when she first came back, and as much as Carol wanted her to go back and be a doctor again, Bobby wanted the opposite. He said to his mother, maybe now someone else can be the doctor and you can just be mom.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
she had, the opposite feelings for both her children. But it was really health issues that kept her from going back in full time. And then once she got involved in the other things, then it wasn't kind of a natural path back
Okay.
to medicine. But I hope I've given you a good overview of their story and how it came to be. And did you have any questions
Where is the book available, other than,
The book is available on Amazon, or your bookstore can order it.
okay,
The ebook is on Amazon.
but the
It-
paperback is also on
It's on Amazon.
Amazon, okay.
But I want to give this group that special deal. So if you wanna give a copy of it to a friend or something.
I'd like a copy. I've read it, but I don't,
Okay, great.
We actually got
I will
ours
do
at
that.
Francie and Fritch downtown, the bookstore.
Yeah.
I never
Oh,
heard of it
Frankie and
before.
Finch?
Whatever it is, Frankie and
Yes.
Finch.
Yes, yes.
They had it a couple of years ago, I don't know if they have it now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if she still stocks it or not. They did have it at Indigo Bridge before they went.
So you have additional copies here then?
I do. How about if I leave one for the church? Shall I do that? Do you have a
Okay.
church library?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Probably the most unused room in the church. I'm pretty sure.
I know,
Where's it at?
Yeah,
I know.
exactly.
I'll leave this one for the church, and then I have a couple more copies in my car. I'll get one on my car for you.
We have a book cart that we oftentimes put out with books on. That's probably what we'll do.
Okay, very good.
I was really fascinated about one of the stories of her going to this far place to deliver a baby. And they always laid him on the floor.
Well, I'm going to tell you that story. This was in India early on when she got there. And not only did she do surgeries in that little hut by lantern light, but she would have to go out into the remote villages if there was somebody who was so sick they couldn't be brought in. So she got out to this village, middle of the night, and there was a woman lying on an old mat on the floor. And as she came, these are just straw huts with beautiful floors. The women would scrape and level those floors until they were just perfect. And then they would varnish them. And they made varnish out of water and cow dung. Okay?
Wow.
And they would just shine and gleam. So she was on the floor, couldn't be on the bedding because in their religion they had to burn and everything that birth fluids touched. So she's on the floor, had been in labor for 3 days, and because she'd been on the floor, she now had full-blown tetanus, which meant her cervix was locked. There was no pathway out, but the babe was already in the canal, couldn't do a cesarean. So the people with her said, we just make her comfortable while she and the baby die. That was what was going to be done. The women around her already, that's what would be done. That was the thing to do. And Dorothy wouldn't have it. She got that woman onto her car and back to the clinic, and she removed the cervix and delivered the baby. And the woman survived and the baby survived. Wow. She saw them years later. Because she would not accept the fact that there was no solution, there was no way to save this woman or the baby.
That was really interesting.
That's how persistent she was and how gifted she was in
And the other
finding
thing,
the
I
answer.
think in the book it said she never lost a child in the prison camp.
No, she had 400 children, she never lost a child.
And her children were they the same weight when they came out as they went in, or?
No. Yes, they were.
Yeah.
He was 18 months old.
Yeah.
And when he was 5 years old coming out of the camp, he was the same weight as
Yeah.
when he went into the camp. Yes, that's correct.
I'm sure you shared with them that just the night before they were rescued, that they would have been executed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Miracle.
yeah, an absolute miracle, absolute.
God's provision for us.
Yes, and both Dorothy and Fred's faith was unshakable. Never questioned, never doubted anything. Their faith was unshakable. Dorothy's father was a missionary in Colorado to the Indians, to the Native Americans. So that's part of how she gravitated to, if I can't practice medicine here in the States, I'll be a missionary.
She even questioned getting married because she wasn't sure her father was gonna go along with that.
Yeah, her commitment as a doctor, as a missionary, was a lifetime commitment, and she felt she was going to have to apologize over and over and over to her father for getting married, because the missionaries, once you're married, it was the man's mission, and the wife was there to support whatever the man had to do in that mission. She was not to have a mission of her own. She was to support him. Well, she wouldn't do that. She kept practicing medicine, and she managed to do it.
Just in our church, she did not assume an extra role. It was just the support of the mission of Pastor Fred. So she really played that role in wonderful support.
I'm going to tell you a story since you know them. I've got to go, but I've got to tell you this. I got really annoyed with Fred because I read an 80-page document that Fred wrote about his history. It was his memoir of that time, both in Jorhat, India, and in the Philippines. In that 80 pages, he mentioned the children once and Dorothy twice. Briefly, not even a full sentence. He was very proud of her. The one sentence he wrote about her was pride in what she was doing. But, you know, to write 80 pages of that experience, and Dorothy doesn't appear in it, but once that annoyed me. So I wrote a scene. There was a time in the prison camp when she had 3 doses of a medication. She had 5 children who needed it, 5 desperate little patients who needed it. She was agonizing over, how do I decide which of these 3 children gets the medicine and which 2 don't? Do I give it to the weakest so they'd have a chance to survive? Do I give it to the strongest to make sure they survive? What do I do? So she shares this with Fred, this dilemma, and he says, well, Dorothy, you always do the right thing. It'll be fine. And he says, now, I've got to go teach a class. You go, he says, you go fix their little boo-boos and I'll go fill them with heads. Yeah, so I wrote this scene and I wrote a flaming reaction in Dorothy. Just flaming. And so just before I was taking the manuscript out to Bob and Bobby and May, I thought, I can't write that scene. That's just, I can't have that in. So I rewrote it, wrote it very quiet. I wrote her dilemma, but I didn't write her reaction to his thing. So we're in this meeting where they said, we think Dorothy came down and sat beside you when you wrote this. In that meeting, I said, was there anything now that I should change, that I just didn't do right, that you really think needs to be fixed? And nobody said anything, and then Bobby says, well, there is one thing. And she says, you know the little boo-boo scene? And I thought, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have left it in at all. And I said, I'm sorry. I was just a little annoyed with Fred at that moment, so I wrote that scene. And I said, I'll take it out. And she said, no. She says, make it bigger. She says, make it bigger. I was shocked. And Maine told me then that in their whole life, the family had privately been annoyed at Fred's diminishing of Dorothy's experience. Yeah. But you can't blame him because she spent her whole life making sure his pedestal was shiny and clean, you know?
Yeah.
That's what she did her whole life. So, of course, that's the way he would feel. Anyway, I thought you'd enjoy that story, knowing that.
But it was never evident that he put her down.
No, that's what they said. It was absolutely private. It was a private annoyance among the family, is how they put it to me.
And it never showed in ministry there, in the love of the 2 of them.
Yeah, and they told me it was a love story, clear through, you know, till he was 84 and she was 100. It was a love story that never waned. Well, I've got to go take my granddaughter to dance class, so I
Which
really
way do
enjoyed
you
being
park?
with you.
Are you-
I'm right out here.
Okay,
She'll
I'll
go
be
out
right
this
there.
door.
I'll come out with you, yeah.
Thanks.